Welcome to the Red, White, and Rude. I'm your host, William Del Pilar, a former liberal conservative Latino who believes politics is downstream of culture. However, in today's new world, saying downstream may no longer be true as they now go hand in hand. Supergirl, today's topic, is a perfect example of why. Because every time Hollywood gets caught pushing woke trash, the response is never to look at the product first. It's to blame the audience, scold the fans, and pretend the real problem is that people aren't enlightened enough to show up. The actress Millie Alcock, let's be honest, reminds us of the Pharaoh kid in Mad Max Road Warrior. Sad but true. Can't help but fall into the media trap of promoting the film as an LGBTQ plus moment, saying that she doesn't live inside the binary of what we think a woman should be, and even proclaiming Supergirl goes both ways. In essence, taking what the creators created and bastardizing it, and thus destroying what and who Supergirl really is. Then there's studio leadership, doubling down on the messaging and then acting shocked when the box office says no. That's the pattern, and that's what tonight's episode is really about. Not just one movie, not just one bad opening. It's about a whole system that keeps mistaking ideology for entertainment, then turning around and acting like the fans are the ones who failed. And that is what Supergirl, the actress who plays her, and the studio that created this trash epitomize. Supergirl didn't just open soft, it exposed the DC Universe reset as a fragile, overhyped pitch dressed up as morality. A movie that was supposed to prove the new DC Universe had momentum instead turned into a question mark on opening weekend. That's the problem. Not only were the numbers disappointing, but the disappointment hit so fast that it blew a hole straight through the launch narrative that continues into week 3. James Gunn and Peter Safran are now backtracking, grasping at straws, and blaming the fans. With new ownership coming in, they may also be looking at the possible end of their leadership of the DC Universe. Because once a film opens to 37 million domestic, when original expectations were as high as 75 million, yes, they were. You're no longer talking about a triumphant beginning. You're talking about damage control. With progressives, that usually means throwing somebody else under the bus to save face. It also means a studio trying to spin a fresh start as a success, even when audiences clearly didn't buy it after the mediocrity of Superman. Superman, a movie they pitched as a blockbuster success, despite the numbers not backing that up. As we can all see, they believe their own lies and doomed Supergirl from the moment it was conceptualized to be another woke piece of feminist trash. That matters even more as this was being sold as the movie that would validate the whole DC Universe direction. But the truth is simple. This wasn't just one bad opening, it was a first blatantly obvious crack in the message they're trying to sell. A message most people ignored with Superman. The launch was being treated like a win before the audience had even decided it was worth showing up for. And now the numbers are doing what marketing couldn't. They're telling the ugly truth. We reject your messaging. That's why Supergirl is a right place to start this 3-part series. First, Supergirl, then Hollywood going woke, going broke, and staying woke. And finally, why Citizen Vigilante is becoming a blockbuster on a $2 million budget. If the first big test of the new DC plan post Superman lands like this, then the bigger question isn't whether this movie underperformed. The question is whether the whole reset was built on hype, with wokeness purposely ignoring the actual demand for a great superhero film built on an all American girl. Before we get right into it, please make sure you like and share this podcast. Subscribe to our Grumblings Media Culture channel. Grumblings Media, if you're on Rumble, I appreciate. We are an all volunteer team and we enjoy doing this. We enjoy bringing you guys ugly truth. All right, let's get into it. Was this just a bad opening or the first real crack in the new DC plan? Well, we know it's a bad opening. Supergirl opened to roughly 37.1 million domestically. That immediately turned the film into a box office story instead of a launch story about the DC universe. Now, it's as of the last count, it's earned 115 million worldwide. That's after about 17 days of release. You're seeing this on about the 21st day, but it's a dog. It suffered a 77% catastrophic drop in week 2, earning about 8.6 million out of a country of 350 million. Out of a DC universe that has produced superheroes from what, the 40s? And Supergirl's what, from the 50s? Beloved hero? And it was pulled from over 1,000 theaters by week 3. That's about a 23% drop. It's a 59% drop financially, earning 3.8 million in week 3. So let me backtrack. It earned 8.5 million week 2, close to 4 million week 3. It was pulled from over 1,000 theaters by week 3, and its VOD run will begin July 28th. They were hoping July 28th, this movie would still be in theaters. Now, the move to VOD is being done to recover losses. In Hollywood math, let's break this down with some math. A film usually needs about 2.5 to 3 time multiplier its production budget to break even. Why? Because studios keep about half of domestic box office and often 40% or less overseas. And in fact, in China, they say they keep a quarter out of every dollar. I don't know, but that was one report I read. It probably depends on which studio and what movie. And that matters here because Supergirl was done on a reported budget of about 170 million, which means the movie is not just chasing a solid opening, it's fighting for survival, which we now know it has obviously lost. Again, 37 million opening, a budget reported at about 170 to 186 million production or cost. Now that's not marketing. Marketing is estimated at about 120 million. So the real investment is about 290 million before ancillary costs. It's facing a very steep climb to break even with all the deals it has in place, the VOD. I'm lying. It's going to take a bloodbath. And let me explain why. Using $186 million production budget, and because it's marketing at 120 million, we are going to use a 3-point Hollywood break-even formula. Normally, if it's about $20-30 million marketing, or maybe even as high as 50, you can use a 2.5 to about 2.6, 2.7 formula. But because this is at 120 million, you're looking at a 3.0 formula. So at the low end of 170 million, it needed a 510 million global gross to break even. At the high end, it needed about 560 million global gross to break even. Warner Brothers stated, and nobody believes this, that it needed 315 million to break even. And that was optimistic because they had prearranged streaming television and, again, ancillary merchandising licensing deals. I question those numbers. Early reports are looking at about $100 million loss, and recent reports now show a potential $200 million loss. The way it completely collapsed, I believe those numbers could go as high as 300 million. But 200 million alone is that's where ownership of Paramount goes. We got to go back to the drawing board. James, Peter, we need to meet. Okay, so Supergirl is clearly a box office catastrophe for Warner Brothers. The real question now is how big a crack is this in James Gunn's new DCU? DC Universe. And who bears the blame? The film, the marketing, or Gunn's overall reboot strategy? Well, let's take those one by one here, real quick. This is a massive crack. This is the second movie after a mediocre Superman. When you have a big tent release like Superman, it's got to have monstrous numbers. The numbers have to be monster scale. It generates excitement, gives you great marketing. They weren't there, but they pretended they were there. And now comes Supergirl in a total collapse. This is a massive crack, my friends. I'm going to get deeper into it as the podcast goes. And who bears the blame? The marketing, Gunn's overall reboot strategy. And what the hell is it with them trying to make this look like the Road Warrior space version? The writing, the directing. So this is a complete collapse from the top to the bottom. But before we talk about who's getting blamed in depth, let's look at the launch that was sold as a win. And this is very important. I call this segment the fake DCU win. And my goal here is to show you that the Superman launch, it was sold as stronger than it really was. It was the first film of the DC Universe, Peter Gunn's big tent launch. And it was presented as a major success, but the numbers did not support the idea that it was a runaway launch. So, and again, some of you may know this stuff. Some of the older listeners probably don't that listen to me. I know I have some silver-maned listeners. So the domestic gross of Superman, which came out last year, which I have still yet to see. It's free on Amazon right now, and I keep wanting to see it. But look, I got to be honest. Since the Brandon Roth Superman, I've just been down on a DC Universe. I've seen some of the movies, not paid too much attention. They're what I call filler. What are you going to watch tonight? Yeah, this is on. Watch it, done. You forget about it. So that's how I look at the DC Universe the last 20 years. Honestly, I really do. And don't get me going on the last, not Robert Pattinson's Batman, but Christian Bale's long, boring. Huh? What do you say? I mean, you can understand the bum. And Bane, who looked like he was emaciated compared to the comic. So I haven't watched the DC Universe really since the turn of the century. And Heath Ledger, talk about one of the most overrated Jokers ever in the history of DC comic cinema. Look, even George Romero in the old throwback 1967 comedy version was a better Joker than Heath Ledger. And Jack Nicholson will always be the gold standard now. But all that said, my point is the DC Universe outside of the Batman series has never really blown up. Before that, the first two Superman movies with Christopher Reeve, but they've really been hit or miss. So then they come out with Superman here. Domestic gross, 354 million. International, 264 million. Worldwide, $618 million. So the production budget of this was $225 million. So the break-even number for that movie was about $563 million worldwide. It did that. But you have to understand, when you throw $225 million into a movie, and this is the big kickoff to your brand new universe, those are numbers that Gunn can sell. Hey, look, we didn't lose money. It was and then they start the lies. It did this, it did that. No, it's a very controversial movie. It was a very anti-American movie in terms of what Superman is supposed to be. So this means that the movie cleared the rough break-even line, but not by some enormous margin that would justify acting like the DCU was already bulletproof. That's how Gunn tried to sell it. The rough theatrical profit is about $125 million. And that's real money, but far short of the kind of dominant launch that makes a new universe feel inevitable. The key distinction is simple here, my friends. profit is not the same thing as a franchise mandate. Superman may have been a theatrical win, but it was more like a tie in football because it wasn't the kind of overwhelming breakout that proves a whole new direction has been validated. That's Gunn's direction. And they were trying to sell it as Gunn's vision has been validated. And it was not. But because they kept saying that over and over and over, they believed the lie heading into Supergirl. And the point lands. The studio and its defenders treated a solid result in Superman like proof the whole launch was safe. It was from the top down how great the movie was. The critical error is not that Superman lost money, it's that it was treated like an untouchable victory when it was really a respectable but not decisive start. Part of that is a conservative progressive battle. Most of these movies bomb. So even as it eked across the break-even point and then made a few dollars, every progressive, see, it made money. They were completely missing the big picture of what we conservatives talk about. And that is the long-term ramification of what woke does. And the messaging props used to deliver the woke message are no longer working. And Superman was one of them. I think Man of Tomorrow that comes out next year, I got to be honest, I'm not sure it's going to come out next year if new ownership comes in time to stop it. But my understanding is it's already being filmed, et cetera, et cetera. So we're stuck with it. But I'm not sure it'll do as well as the last Superman. A real franchise reset, people, needs a massive win that makes the new direction feel unavoidable. Instead, the result was managed like a bigger triumph than it really was. That created false confidence going into Supergirl. No, it did not, William. Really? Look at the numbers of Supergirl. I win. That false confidence, it does matter, people, because it shows they believed in their own talking points. Or as I'd say, they believe their own lies. They sold the launch to the media and the audience in a way any objective observer could see was inflated. Anybody with half a brain. Now it's obvious they bought their own spin, and the reality is simple. If the first win is padded, the next loss hit twice as hard. Or in this case, 200 million to 300 million times as hard. So look, Superman made money. No one disputes that. But did the studio and its defenders believe in their own hype and treat a respectable win like a world-changing triumph? Yes. And were they just selling it hard enough that they convinced themselves to? Yes, again. And did that inflated confidence set Supergirl up for an even harder fall? And what does it say about the new DCU's foundation? Well, it set Supergirl up for an even harder fall because they believed their lies, and thus they looked at what they were doing on Supergirl as magic. Now, there were internal struggles. There's a director's cut and a studio's cut, and Gunn threw his hands in, messing with the music. So you had too many chiefs stirring the pot. And that's done when you don't have strong leadership. And that's Saffron and Gunn. We're going to talk about them in a bit. But I think Supergirl may have been doomed regardless if they had even read the numbers properly, because they're not going to change their progressive mindset. So now the question becomes, what happens when the second movie arrives and the story falls apart? The aftermath. Well, I call this segment the female lead slump. And I'm going to talk a bit about Supergirl landing inside a larger pattern of female-led superhero disappointment, meaning female-led superhero movies that have bombed, including streaming. If you look at the She-Hulk, for example. So I feel bad. I don't want to crack on women here, but Supergirl is not landing in a vacuum. It arrives after a run of female-led superhero projects. And that already made audiences skeptical. And let me make a quick note here before I get into some of these movies. They were saying that Men were crapping all over Supergirl. Man, this, men, this, how evil, how vile. They were the ones who actually went to the movie more so than women. Think about it. The opening scene is a dog peeing on Superman. That wipes out any father who wants to take their little girl to the movie. She kills somebody at the end, going completely against her character. And that's all of Hollywood. They want to take our good characters who would never cross that line and make them cross that line for that big moment. Kind of like Star Trek Generations. And they killed off Kirk for ticket sales. It goes contrary to the character, to that universe, to what the creators built. Mothers don't want to take their daughters to go see an un-American girl who's pretty much a drunk, is negative on life, it's just miserable. So girls did not go. The numbers bear that out. So back to the female-led superhero projects that had gone from the studio to the trash can. Madam Web 2024, about $100.5 million worldwide versus roughly about $160 million total cost. The Marvels 2023, about $206 million worldwide versus roughly, $400 million total cost. Black Widow 2021, about $380 million worldwide versus about $350 million total cost. Now, in defense of the Black Widow, this was a pandemic release with a short theater run and a simultaneous release on Disney+. Wonder Woman 2020, about $120 million worldwide versus roughly $300 million total cost. Another pandemic release that debuted in both theaters and on HBO Max on the same day. Birds of Prey 2020, about $205 million worldwide versus $130 million total cost. Batgirl, supposedly it was so bad it was shelved. And they had the original Batman, Michael Keaton there, and the cat from the Mummy, Brendan Fraser. Michael Keaton was pretty much what you would expect. Contract work. That's what happens in Hollywood. They expected him to go off on Hollywood, and how dare they shelve it like every LGBT person did, every progressive did, everybody did. It was Warner Brothers' decision. So it was about at 90 million, and they said it was so bad they permanently shelved it for tax reasons. It was used as a corporate tax write-off. So there's just those movies alone, they missed their targets by over 500 million and about 420 million in financial losses. So the important point is not women can't lead action movies, but that studios keep packaging these projects with the same message: woke heavy, lecture heavy, or franchise repair energy. They're not coming at you with excitement, with that 1920s, 1930s, you want to come back next week to catch the next segment of that weekly serial. That type of energy where the kids want to go see it. I remember Star Wars. There were lines around the block to see that. I remember Batman, Michael Keaton's. There were lines on pre-opening night when they show it before opening day, late at night. These had none of that magic, had none of that energy. Then you got the press circuit. The conversation often gets turned into identity politics and culture war signaling. I mean, it's not a superhero movie, but Snow White epitomized that. Massive financial bloodbath. You have cast members and marketers sound like they're selling a message of wokeness first and a movie second. And that backfires when the audience feels like the film is talking down to them. Looking at the white male or the white individual, whether a female or male, that you're the bad person. The heterosexual, you're the bad person. As they promote a lesbian superhero, as in Birds of Prey. Especially when the promotion comes off as blaming everybody and still saying you need to come out and watch this film. You're going to blame me and mock fans or treat skepticism of this movie's as a moral failure of America. And then turn around and say, but you need to come out and watch the movie. That's not how it works. That approach creates fatigue because viewers feel like they are being sold a cultural statement instead of a movie. Supergirl becomes the latest proof point in that pattern. The reaction feels bigger than the hype of the new James Gunn and Peter Safran led DC universe. And my point, what I'm trying to say is the negative reaction was bigger than all the hype. And that says something about Hollywood and where they're at now and why they're now blaming the last, 8 years. They blame the fans. They blame it on anti-woman. They blame everything but themselves, looking in the mirror and going, well, maybe we didn't give them what they wanted. We're not rejecting the idea of a female hero. We're not rejecting that at all. We're rejecting female masculinity dominating men. We're rejecting people who want politics in other movies. We're rejecting woke product strategy that keeps missing the audience. Progressives aren't going out there buying your stuff. They never do. And the worst, actors trashing their own audience during the press junkets. So why have so many female-led superhero films underperformed in recent years? Well, as I said, it's a woke messaging. How much of that comes down to the way they're positioned and marketed? Well, they're now marketed by attacking those who they believe will trash the movie. Black Panther's another great one. White Americans loved it. But the left turned it into an identity movie. My friend's kids, they couldn't conceive it was created by white individuals. Then when I told them the Jewish creation, that kind of blew their heads up. But when I was talking to them, I was making them realize, you see, that's a great process of how whites don't look at blacks like Democrats tell you that Republicans and conservatives look at blacks. And because I was an adult and their friend's dad, they listened to me, but who knows, in one ear and out the other, who knows. But all you can do is talk. Because for us to come together, myself as a Latino, we have to have that conversation, ugly or not. But I'm digressing. Some follow-up thoughts. Are studios misreading audience fatigue by leading with cultural messaging instead of pure entertainment? Yes. Yes, they are. And the question is, when will they stop or when will they come to their senses? And when these projects miss, is the core issue the movie itself or the press tour and promotional strategy surrounding it? All of it. I mean, even Peter Dinklage, what a little moron. It's offensive that we have little people dressed up, as the dwarves in Snow White. So what did Disney do? Well, they digitized them all. And no little person got a job. But Peter, he's got his millions. He broke the mold. Instead of being a role model, he craps on his own kind. Then you had Rachel Zegler in Snow White. Then you have Millie Alcock with all the LGBT crap. And then you have the movie itself. She's not an all-American girl. She's a miserable, mean girl. Once these patterns become obvious, the next move is always the same. Blame the audience instead of the formula. I mean, it becomes disappointing after a while to keep getting blamed for something you had no hand in. What they're saying is you need to spend the hard money you earn on our ideology. And if you don't, you're a misogynist, you're a racist. And it goes on and on. So they won't even look in the mirror. That's kind of what I want to talk about in this segment. Supergirl's crash is what I called it. So obviously this was a bad start for the DC Studios' next phase. And the reason I say it's a bad start is Superman obviously was going to break even. I always thought it would at least break even. And I'll be honest, I hoped it wouldn't make much more than that because I love the character, but loathe the new head of the DC Universe, James Gunn. He's woke trash. I'm getting ahead of myself. We're going to talk about that. So the numbers immediately made Supergirl the symbol of a downward spiral for DC Studios. So Supergirl was the big test for the next phase. And Superman also proved what many of us believed at the time, but were ignored. Superman had politically correct terminology and marketing, and if ignored, the DC universe would suffer. What am I saying? He was no longer American, he was for the world. No, he's an American icon, an American hero. I haven't seen it because of that. Whoa, William, you're missing a good movie. Am I? Really? I don't think so. I wasn't the only one who thought like that. Superman wasn't the big tent blockbuster they wanted us to believe. We saw that. But they ignored it purposely because they saw it too. They defended it. Coverage of the film focused on weak tracking, soft enthusiasm, and the growing sense that the audience it was aimed at was not showing up with excitement in regards to Supergirl. Reviews were brutal. And this is from their supporters. So the movie was being hurt before the word of mouth could even help it. So from the get-go, Supergirl was doomed. The online reaction turned into memes and ridicule. God, you should see some of the Road Warrior Millie Alcock memes. When I first saw the previews, I looked at my wife. I said, babe, she looks like that little kid from the Road Warrior. And I wasn't trying to be mean. That's what came to my mind. And a lot of people didn't buy the 2'8" Millie Alcock. I'm exaggerating. I don't know how tall she is, but if I remember correctly, she's like under 5 foot or barely 5 feet. But they didn't buy her as a lead, as a physical action hero. And that also became part of the backlash. So the bigger issue was the movie was packaged like a broad blockbuster, but it felt to many people like a forced cultural correction instead of entertainment. Another segment you want to come are the fans of the comics. What's the matter with you? Is how they look at the writing, the directing, and the movie itself. And the ending felt overmanaged from the inside. And that usually shows up when the studio, or in this case, the female writer, is trying too hard to force a result, which really hurts the flow. And that kind of approach often leaves the finished product feeling engineered. In the final scene where she takes somebody out, where in the comic, the graphic novel, she does it because she's Supergirl. And she won't do that. It just made no sense. It was forced. They're trying to make her into a badass, and it just didn't work. So in essence, it felt engineered and it wasn't earned, meaning we're like, holy mackerel, that was phenomenal. We're like, holy mackerel, how bad can you get? Thank God. Oh, Pops, little Dave, wake up, time to leave, movie's over. But one of the reviewers said it was kryptonite to anyone who likes good superhero movies. That's great. We want a movie, not a lecture wrapped in branding. And that's what we got. And the key issue is not just the weak opening and the subsequent collapse. It tells us that from the get-go, the audience never had confidence. If the writers were trashing it, if you had to use multiple cuts and get focus groups, it was from the beginning. The weak opening, that was just the icing on the cake, and the collapse was the final nail in the coffin. She bombed with a $37 million opening, a second week collapse, and then was pulled from over 1,000 theaters by week 3. I'd say it's probably down to about 15, 20% theaters. What they'll do is, if the theaters are contractually obligated, they'll run 1 or 2 showings in the morning and then bring in a new movie. So what's that tell us about how confident DC Studios actually was in their big reboot? I don't know. I think when tracking is soft, reviews are mixed to negative, and memes run brutal before opening weekend, shouldn't the studios have looked at, we need to take a step back? And I'm talking about Superman. Again, it made 100 million, but it wasn't the blockbuster. And what that tells me is this has indeed become an unbreakable pattern. Here's the other thing, and it's a bad thing on social media. The real damage is done when the audience starts to openly mock the film online. Some people will say, can word of mouth and marketing still rescue it at that point? In most cases, it can. The big test is going to be Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey. It's going to have a great opening weekend, and progressives are going to jump all over that. It's a Christopher Nolan film. The Odyssey has legs in international markets. Question is, will it have long-term legs past opening weekend? We'll find out. But regardless, once the box office starts to slip, as in Supergirl or Superman, with the not so great openings, the next move is usually not accountability, but blame. In other words, after it tanks, we get a blame shift. Safran and Gunn's The Blame Shift. We're going to talk about deflection, not just disappointment from the leadership. So the response around Supergirl leaned toward blaming the audience and shifting the attention away from the product, despite the fact they had to do a couple of cuts of it, reshoots, bad writing. I mean, it was doomed from the get-go, but they blamed the audience instead of Supergirl. And that's a bigger pattern when a movie underperforms. Studios today often reach for excuses before they examine whether the movie itself connected and if they're responsible for a subpar product. It even happens in streaming. With the Rings of Power at Amazon, terrible, terrible, terrible series. It's costing Amazon hundreds of millions because it went completely woke from the get-go, disrespected the creator, and it's a disgrace to the Tolkien memory money grab. That's all it is. But when it comes to Supergirl or these big tent movies or the Rings of Power, the more they treat criticism as an enemy, the less likely they are to fix what failed on screen, as we have seen with the Rings of Power entering season 5, because their egos are like, we're going to run this series regardless. But the blame the fans dynamic matters because it shows studios still think audience resistance is a problem. They just don't get us yet. We got to deliver this message in a different way. And that's going to keep future movies from actually improving and delivering not only for the studios financially, but the fans creatively. In this case, reaction makes the box office miss feel like a culture clash instead of a business correction. So after Supergirl's collapse, we saw that same familiar pattern, the quick deflection and the blame shifting away from the studio and the director and the writer. So why does the industry so often rush to blame the audience instead of examining the product itself, is what you need to ask yourself. Because they refuse to change their view on their ideology and look at us as the problem, and we need to figure it out. So does blaming the fans for framing this as a culture clash ever actually win the audience's back? Or does it make the disconnect worse? Well, it makes the disconnect worse, as we've seen the last 10 years. Netflix has had more one-and-done season series, and network television have gone into season 2s with mediocre ratings to see that woke show collapse in that second season. So when executives double down on defending the vision of progressivism, of leftism, of equity, not equality, instead of addressing clear audience feedback, what does that tell us about the chances for the next DCU film? Not very good, and it's Clayface, which nobody asked for, a horror movie. And if you're going to have to go R. I don't know how it came about, but unless you're an actual comic book aficionado, you really don't know who Clayface is. What are the storylines with Clayface in the DC universe? I can't remember. Moving on. There's the double standard that makes this whole thing even uglier. I call it the Gunn double standard. So my point in this segment is hypocrisy. I'm going to go into the weeds a little bit because I don't like the fact that James Gunn is still sitting on top after other people have been canceled for stuff that he's done and he wasn't. It's the hypocrisy of Hollywood. One class of people gets permanently canceled, which is wrong, and the other gets rehabilitated. If you're going to rehabilitate one side because of their ideology, you need to do it across the board, and they won't. James Gunn was fired in 2018 from Marvel after old tweets resurfaced that joked about pedophilia and rape. And we're not talking one or two, quite a handful there. And the reporting on that firing made the controversy explicit. The contrast is not just that he was punished, but that he later returned to a major Hollywood role, continuing on at Marvel and now at DC, once Hollywood felt his pedophile statements had died down. And that creates an obvious double standard. Conservatives and outsiders can be permanently erased, while leftists in Hollywood will be restored. The old cancellation story matters because it shows how Hollywood's moral standards can change depending on who it wants to keep. In the context of Supergirl, that history matters because Gunn seemed to think that progressive gatekeepers, the fans, would carry the film. He thought there were all progressive fans would show up to make this a success. Conservatives would show up because it was Superman. And we didn't. It made a small profit. But for some ungodly reason, he thought we would fall into this progressive garbage and show up for Supergirl. And what it boils down to is that he thought his brand was invincible after the tweet controversy. I got away with it. I can do anything I want. I am gone. So he thought he could make even a weak product look like a win in Superman and thought he was invincible. It would carry over into Supergirl. James Gunn was fired quickly, uncanceled, and then he was handed the keys to the entire DC universe. And we know why. It's because he was progressive. Hollywood only cancels conservatives. Now he's going to get a third chance if they keep him on with new ownership. New ownership should fire him like that. But he's around because his politics align with the industry. And that's what emboldened him to keep pushing the same woke messaging and subpar trash. I mean, we haven't even talked about Peacemaker, where he gave his wife a gig. I don't know. I think the tweets and what's happened and how he survived and thrived, and those are things that should make you go, how can the industry preach accountability while clearly applying totally different rules depending on which side you're on? Easy. He's a leftist. That's why. And that brings us to the real stakes for DC going forward. The immediate question is whether DC Studios can recover credibility after all this trash, this woke trash. Supergirl is not just one flop. It's a kind of bomb that changes how every next release is judged. If people even give the next release a chance. Think about it. Superman, Supergirl, then Clayface? Oh, what's Clayface? Huh? Ooh, what? So if the studio keeps explaining away misses instead of fixing the product, the audience is going to be even more skeptical. And that's why I think Clayface is going to be a nightmare. They are right now stressing on how to market that. So the bigger lesson is that viewers are already voting with their wallets. Superman, Supergirl, an American icon. Period. End of story. Represents America. Period. End of story. But these leftists have destroyed our country in so many ways that now they worry about releasing an American movie into the international market because they themselves have destroyed the American brand. And we're voting with our wallets domestically. And we do not owe any franchise blind loyalty. I was a comic book collector until I was a young adult. And after I left the military, got to give comics up. And I gave it up at the right point. They became trash. I started to notice a change, subpar art, a lot of weak artistry since the 2000s, a lot of woke storylines. I don't owe them any blind loyalty. I haven't even seen the trilogy, the last 3 Marvel movies of the Thanos Infinity Saga. I was so tired of the nonsense. Now, the other note, though, for Warner Brothers and DC Universe, and you heard me mention it already, is they're on the verge of being owned by Skydance and the Ellisons, who have signaled a desire to move away from DEI and woke messaging, which goes against everything James Gunn represents and is pushing his last 2 movies. So once Skydance takes control after the merger finalizes, and it will, the next question is whether the new leadership decides this DC Universe helmed by Gunn and Safran needs its own reset. It does. If the underperformance continues, the pressure shifts from the movies themselves to the people steering them, creating them, producing them, spending hundreds of millions of dollars that are going into a money pit. The next release again is Clayface, a movie no one asked for because nobody knows when Robert Pattinson's The Batman Part 2 is coming. That's the other thing. Gunn needs to give this writer, I forget his name, Matt Reeves, I guess. He hasn't written the movie yet. It's been, 5 years now? I don't know. It's been a long time. I'm going to fire his ass and bring somebody else in. That's the only real big box office lifeline on the horizon. And it still doesn't feel close enough to matter. So after launch is rough for Supergirl, can DC Studios still sell the next movie as a true fresh start? I don't know. Clayface is a horror movie. But I think the audience has already lost their trust in Gunn and Safran's visions. We're voting with our wallets. We're rejecting this current direction, from both Marvel and DC, Disney and Warner Brothers from the past 10 years. So what does the studio have to actually change next time? Give us a movie we want, a movie that's not woke, a movie that entertains us, that makes us want to root for the hero, that we don't cringe every time they want to bash an actual American who's buying a ticket. Because we're not going to buy the ticket. Have them bash the bad guy, the villain, that's it. So change the messaging. Gunn and Safran should see this as a clear warning with new leadership coming in. And I don't think they do. How many more warnings does Hollywood overall need at Marvel, at DC, at Warner's? I think we're getting to that breaking point, but we're still not there yet. Let's close this out. Supergirl didn't just flop, it exposed the whole fake launch. The opening came in at about 37 million domestic, 100 million globally after 10 days, 115 million after 17 days, removed from 1,000 theaters by week 3, showing the DC reset was weak and nowhere near as strong as they originally thought it would be or was. When audiences feel manipulated, they stop showing up. The studio wants credit for the win and denial for the loss. Gunn got forgiven after old tweets that would have buried most people forever. Hollywood doesn't want accountability. It wants applause for the spin. And the result? The audience is done pretending the messaging is the product. They're responding with their wallets and saying, give us a great product or go woke and go broke. And that's our show, people. Thank you for listening to the Red, White, and Rude. Please share, like, and follow us on YouTube at Grumblings Media Culture and on Rumble at Grumblings Media. Next up is part 2, where we get into the bigger picture of Hollywood going woke, losing money, and seemingly not caring. Then we'll close it out with part 3, where we take on Citizen Vigilante. Despite being banned, why is it suddenly reaching the top of the charts on Amazon, Apple, and Fandango at home, while also dominating Rotten Tomatoes? All of that despite being an uneven and typical Uwe Boll movie. Until next time, I am William Del Pilar. Stay safe and stay rude. Hey everybody, this is William Del Pilar, founder of Grumblings Media, and I want to say thank you for watching our content. If you want to support our all-volunteer efforts at Grumblings Media, smash the subscribe button right here. 100% free, and please consume and share our great content. Click either one of these 2 boxes for more of our work.